What if I told you that in 1973, when muscle cars were supposedly dead and Detroit was surrendering to emissions regulations, one company secretly built the most over-engineered V8 of the entire decade? An engine so bulletproof it came with provisions for dry sump racing oiling, so tough that it could handle double its factory horsepower without breaking a sweat, and so rare that most people have never even heard of it. This isn't some back-alley hot rod build we're talking about. This was a factory engine from Pontiac, an engine they deliberately kept quiet about while Ford, Chrysler, and even their own GM siblings were waving the white flag on performance. The Super Duty 455 was Detroit's best-kept secret, hidden in plain sight during the darkest days of American muscle. Today, we're uncovering the story of Pontiac's ultimate sleeper and why this might just be the greatest high-performance engine you've never heard of. To understand why the Super Duty 455 was so revolutionary, we need to set the stage. By 1972, the writing was on the wall for high-performance engines. The Clean Air Act of 1970 was tightening its grip on emissions. Insurance companies were penalizing muscle car owners with sky-high premiums, and the general public was turning against gas-guzzling performance cars. General Motors had already issued their corporate edict: no engines larger than 400 cubic inches in intermediate cars. This killed the 454 in the Chevelle SS, the 455 in the Buick GS, and should have ended Pontiac's big block dreams right there. But Pontiac had always been the rebel division at GM, and they weren't going down without a fight. The regular Pontiac 455, introduced in 1970, had already seen its power ratings slashed. The original 455 HO made a legitimate 370 gross horsepower and a massive 500 pound-feet of torque. But by 1972, compression ratios were dropping, camshafts were getting milder, and power was evaporating faster than gas at a muscle car meet. Other manufacturers were following similar paths. Ford's 429 Cobra Jet was being neutered. Chrysler's legendary 446 pack was discontinued after 1971. And even the mighty 426 Hemi was living on borrowed time. The party was over, or so everyone thought. But at Pontiac, a small group of engineers, led by Bill Collins, had a different plan. They weren't just going to build another detuned, emissions-compliant engine. They were going to create something special, an engine that would meet all the new regulations while hiding the potential for massive performance just beneath the surface. The result would be the Super Duty 455, and it represented everything Pontiac stood for: innovative engineering, rebellious spirit, and raw American muscle wrapped in a package that could slip past both corporate bean counters and federal regulators. The Super Duty 455 project began in 1971, but its roots go back even further. Bill Collins, Pontiac's assistant chief engineer, had been watching the performance landscape change dramatically. He knew that the days of 11-to-1 compression ratios and radical camshafts were numbered, but he also understood something that most other engineers missed. You could still build a bulletproof foundation for performance, even if you had to tune it mildly from the factory. Collins and his team, including engineers like Malcolm McKellar and Jim Wangers, began working on what they internally called Project 455 SD. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity. Build an engine block so strong and so over-engineered that it could handle whatever punishment enthusiasts could throw at it, but tune it conservatively enough to meet all emissions and corporate requirements. The Super Duty 455 wasn't just a regular 455 with a few tweaks, it was a completely different animal. The project team started with a clean sheet design, borrowing lessons learned from Pontiac's racing programs and applying them to a street engine. They studied the failures of other big blocks, analyzed the stress points in high-performance applications, and set out to build the ultimate foundation for power. The timing was critical. Pontiac knew they had a narrow window to get this engine into production before corporate pressure and federal regulations made it impossible. They also knew they had to be smart about how they marketed it. This couldn't look like another muscle car engine. It had to appear as just another emissions-compliant motor that happened to have some heavy-duty components. The engineering team faced enormous challenges. They had to create an engine that would pass emissions testing with flying colors, meet GM's corporate displacement limits through creative interpretation, satisfy insurance company concerns about high-performance engines, and still provide the foundation for serious power potential. It was like being asked to build a race car that looked like a grocery getter. But Collins and his team were up for the challenge. They had learned from Pontiac's legendary engines of the past, the Super Duty 389s and 421s that had dominated NASCAR and drag racing in the early 1960s. They understood that true performance came from strength and durability, not just high compression and wild camshafts. The Super Duty 455 would be their masterpiece. The foundation starts with the block itself. The Super Duty 455 used a strengthened cylinder block that included 4-bolt main bearings and added material in various locations for improved strength. But calling it strengthened is like calling the Hoover Dam a decent wall. This block was massively overbuilt, with thicker cylinder walls, additional webbing throughout the casting, and reinforcements in all the critical stress areas. The 4-bolt main bearing caps weren't just a performance addition. They were overkill in the best possible way. While most engines of the era made do with 2-bolt mains, the Super Duty 455 featured 4-bolt caps on all 5 main bearings. These weren't lightweight aluminum pieces either, but hefty cast iron caps that could handle enormous crankshaft loads without flexing or walking. Perhaps most impressively, the engine block even had provisions for a dry sump oil pump. Think about that for a moment. This was a street engine that came with provisions for a racing-style lubrication system. Pontiac was essentially saying, "We know some of you are going to want to build 600 horsepower monsters with this thing, so we've already thought of that." The reciprocating assembly was equally impressive. The engine featured forged steel connecting rods and pistons, components that were becoming increasingly rare in production engines as manufacturers looked to cut costs. These weren't lightweight pieces designed for fuel economy. They were heavy-duty forgings that could handle whatever power levels you wanted to throw at them. Original plans called for a forged crankshaft, although actual production SD455s received nodular iron crankshafts with minor enhancements. While some enthusiasts consider this a compromise, the reality is that the nodular iron cranks were still incredibly strong, much stronger than the cast iron pieces found in regular production engines. Pontiac had to balance cost with performance, and the nodular iron crank provided 90% of the strength at a fraction of the cost. The cylinder heads told their own story of performance potential. The 455 SD used round port cylinder heads similar to those used on the 1971 455 HO, but these weren't just carryover pieces. The heads featured larger intake and exhaust ports, improved flow characteristics, and the ability to support much higher valve spring pressures than stock heads. The intake manifold was a high-flow cast iron version, and the carburetor a Rochester 4-barrel quadrajet. The LS2 intake manifold was specifically designed for the Super Duty application, with larger plenum volume and improved port matching to the cylinder heads. Even the carburetor was special. The Rochester quadrajet was calibrated specifically for the Super Duty's unique characteristics. But here's where Pontiac's brilliance really showed. Adams and his team designed the engine to be an emissions-friendly starter kit, purposely packaging a mild cam and relatively restrictive exhaust manifolds with a heavily fortified block. They knew that enthusiasts would immediately swap out the mild cam and restrictive exhaust pieces for more aggressive pieces, but they also knew that the engine had to pass emissions testing in its stock configuration. The camshaft profile was deliberately conservative, with relatively mild lift and duration figures that kept emissions in check but left enormous potential on the table. The exhaust manifolds were similarly restrictive, designed more for noise control and emissions compliance than maximum flow. But underneath these mild components was an engine that could easily handle twice its factory power output. This was engineering with a wink and a nod. Pontiac was giving enthusiasts everything they needed to build a monster while maintaining plausible deniability about the engine's true performance potential. Understanding the Super Duty 455's power figures requires some context about how horsepower ratings worked in the early 1970s. At its 1973 press preview in June 1972, Pontiac touted the SD455's prowess and technical specifications. Rated at 310 horsepower at 4,000 RPM and 390 pound-feet at 3,600 RPM for the 1973 model year. Now, 310 horsepower might not sound like much by today's standards, but remember, this was 1973, and at 310 net horsepower, Pontiac's new Super Duty 455 was the most powerful engine available from Detroit. While other manufacturers were struggling to break the 300 horsepower barrier with their emissions-compliant engines, Pontiac had managed to not only exceed it, but do so with considerable margin. The torque figure was equally impressive. 390 pound-feet of torque at just 3,600 RPM meant that this engine delivered its power where you could actually use it on the street. This wasn't a high-strung race engine that needed to be wound up to 6,000 RPM to make power. It was a torque monster that could pull like a freight train from just off idle. In 1974, the Super Duty engine continued, albeit re-rated to 290 horsepower SAE net, reflecting further emissions tuning and the ongoing horsepower wars with federal regulators. But even at 290 horsepower, the SD455 remained the most powerful engine Detroit was offering in those dark days of the mid-1970s. The performance numbers told the real story. Today, these numbers may sound minuscule, but in 1973, this was top performance for any American manufacturer. A 1973 Trans Am with the Super Duty 455 could run the quarter mile in the mid-13-second range. Not bad for an era when most muscle cars were struggling to break into the 14s. But here's where the Super Duty's genius really showed. These were the conservative factory numbers. The engine was designed to handle much more aggressive tuning, and enthusiasts quickly discovered that simple modifications could unlock massive performance gains. A cam swap, headers, and some carburetor tuning could easily push power levels well into the 400-plus horsepower range, and the engine's robust construction meant it could handle the abuse. The beauty of the Super Duty 455 was that it provided a foundation for whatever level of performance you wanted. If you were happy with a quick street car, the factory tune was perfectly adequate. But if you wanted to build a dragstrip terror or road racing weapon, the engine had all the strength and potential you needed. This dual personality, mild-mannered emissions compliance on the outside, raging performance potential on the inside, was exactly what the market needed in 1973. It was Pontiac's way of giving enthusiasts hope during the darkest days of the horsepower wars. If you think finding a Super Duty 455 today is difficult, try understanding exactly how many were built in the first place. Pontiac's production records for the SD455 are frustratingly incomplete, but the numbers we do have tell a story of an engine so rare that most people have never seen one in person. The 1973 Pontiac's Options and Accessories Report reveals that Pontiac installed one LS2 Super Duty 455 into a Le Mans line vehicle, specifically what appears to be the only Super Duty 455 Grand Am ever built. That's not one of the rarest muscle cars ever built, that's the rarest muscle cars ever built. The Trans Am and Firebird formula received the lion's share of Super Duty 455 production, but even these numbers were tiny. The SD registry shows about 125 1973 SD 455 Trans Ams. There are about 250 1974 SD 455 Trans Ams registered, according to Enthusiast Tracking. These numbers represent cars currently known to exist, not original production figures, but they give us a sense of just how rare these engines truly are. The reasons for the low production numbers were numerous. First, the Super Duty 455 was expensive, really expensive. The engine option added significant cost to an already pricey performance car, putting it out of reach for many buyers. Second, insurance companies were specifically targeting high-performance engines, and the Super Duty's reputation preceded it. Many potential buyers were scared off by insurance quotes that could double or triple their annual premiums. Perhaps most importantly, Pontiac didn't heavily advertise the Super Duty option. This wasn't like the GTO or Trans Am marketing blitzes of the late 1960s. Pontiac was deliberately keeping a low profile with the SD455. They knew that drawing too much attention to the engine's capabilities would invite unwanted scrutiny from both corporate headquarters and federal regulators. The result was an engine that was almost too good for its own good. The Super Duty 455 was the ultimate insider's secret. If you knew about it and could afford it, you got access to the most potent engine Detroit was building. But if you weren't plugged into the muscle car underground, you might never have even known it existed. This secretive nature has contributed to the engine's legendary status today. Finding a genuine Super Duty 455 car is like discovering automotive treasure. Values have skyrocketed accordingly. A decent 1973 or 1974 Trans Am with a Super Duty engine can easily command six-figure prices, assuming you can find one for sale at all. The rarity extends beyond just the complete cars. Super Duty 455 engine blocks, cylinder heads, and other components are incredibly sought after by collectors and builders. Even non-running SD455 cores can sell for thousands of dollars as enthusiasts scramble to build tribute cars or restore original examples. This scarcity has also led to a thriving market in fake Super Duty cars. Because the engine option was so rare and valuable, unscrupulous sellers have been known to pass off regular 455 Trans Ams as Super Duty cars, counting on buyers' lack of knowledge about the specific identifying features. True SD455 cars have unique casting numbers, date codes, and assembly details that distinguish them from regular 455 engines, but these details require expertise to verify. The Super Duty 455's influence on American performance extends far beyond its brief 2-year production run. In many ways, this engine represented the last hurrah of old-school American muscle, the final time a manufacturer would build an engine with such obvious performance potential wrapped in emissions-compliant packaging. The engineering lessons learned from the Super Duty program influenced Pontiac's engine development for years to come. The emphasis on durability over peak power, the understanding that strength could be more important than displacement, and the concept of building engines that could grow with owner modifications all became part of Pontiac's engineering philosophy. But perhaps more importantly, the Super Duty 455 proved that the muscle car era didn't have to end with a whimper. While other manufacturers were retreating from performance, Pontiac showed that creative engineering could find ways to work within the new regulatory environment while still delivering genuine high-performance capability. The engine's reputation has only grown over the decades. Modern engine builders studying the Super Duty 455's design are consistently impressed by how well Pontiac anticipated the needs of performance enthusiasts. The 4-bolt main construction, forged internal components, and provision for dry sump oiling were all features that wouldn't become common in production engines for another 2 decades. Today's LS engines from General Motors owe a debt to the Super Duty 455's engineering philosophy. The concept of building a strong, reliable foundation that can support various levels of tune and modification is directly descended from Bill Collins and his team's work in the early 1970s. The LS engines might use aluminum construction and modern fuel injection, but the underlying philosophy of over-engineering for reliability and modification potential comes straight from the Super Duty playbook. The Super Duty 455 has also become a symbol of what might have been. Enthusiasts often wonder what the muscle car era would have looked like if more manufacturers had followed Pontiac's lead, building engines that met regulations while hiding massive performance potential. Instead of the malaise era of the mid-1970s, we might have seen a golden age of tuner cars decades before the import scene made modification mainstream. Modern tribute builds keep the Super Duty spirit alive. Enthusiasts today are building 455-powered cars that would make Bill Collins proud, using modern technology to extract even more performance from the bulletproof foundation he created. These builds often produce power levels that seemed impossible in 1973, proving that the Super Duty's over-engineered construction was even more prescient than its creators realized. The engine has also become a benchmark for other manufacturers attempting to build performance engines for restrictive regulatory environments. The Super Duty 455's approach of conservative factory tuning with massive modification potential has been studied and copied by engine designers around the world. As we wrap up our deep dive into the Super Duty 455, it's worth reflecting on what made this engine so special. In an era when most manufacturers were giving up on performance, Pontiac chose to double down on engineering excellence. They created an engine that could meet every regulatory requirement while hiding the potential for massive power just beneath the surface. The Super Duty 455 represents everything that made American muscle cars great: innovative engineering, rebellious spirit, and the understanding that there's no replacement for displacement when that displacement is properly executed. It was the ultimate sleeper, an engine that looked like just another emissions-compliant motor, but packed the potential of a race engine. Finding a genuine Super Duty 455 today is like discovering automotive gold, and values reflect that rarity. But even if you never own one, the Super Duty's legacy lives on in every modern performance engine that prioritizes strength and modification potential over peak factory power. Bill Collins and his team at Pontiac created something truly special with the Super Duty 455. They proved that the muscle car era didn't have to die quietly, and they gave enthusiasts a foundation that could support whatever level of performance they desired. In doing so, they created not just an engine, but a legend that continues to inspire builders and enthusiasts more than 50 years later. The Super Duty 455, Pontiac's secret weapon in the horsepower wars, and proof that sometimes the best performance comes from the engines you've never heard of.